For most of the 20th century, before refrigeration and imported rice reshaped what an ordinary meal in Okinawa looked like, a single root vegetable supplied somewhere between 60 and 70% of the average person's daily calories. Not a garnish, not an occasional side dish. The bulk of what people who are now in their 90s and hundreds actually ate, meal after meal, for decades, before anyone was studying them, before Okinawa had a reputation as a place people lived unusually long. The vegetable is a purple-fleshed sweet potato, known locally as beni imo, and the people who grew up eating it as the center of their diet, rather than a side item, are the same generation researchers eventually studied when Okinawa turned out to have one of the highest concentrations of centenarians anywhere on Earth. The Okinawa Centenarian study, running for decades under researchers including Bradley and Craig Wilcox, set out to document what this specific, unusually long-lived population actually did, rather than theorize from a distance. The dietary reconstruction that came out of that research placed the purple sweet potato at the absolute center of the traditional diet, well ahead of rice, which supplied a much smaller share, and further ahead still of the soy, seaweed, and modest amounts of pork and fish that rounded out the rest of what people ate through the mid-1900s, the formative decades for the generation now being studied in old age. The potato itself is not native to Okinawa, or to Japan at all. Sweet potatoes originated in Central and South America, and reached Okinawa sometime in the early 1600s through trade routes connecting the islands to China and, indirectly, to the broader Spanish and Portuguese trading networks that had already carried the plant across the Pacific. What made it take hold as a staple, rather than a minor addition, was almost entirely practical. Okinawa's soil and typhoon-prone climate made rice cultivation difficult and unreliable compared to mainland Japan, while sweet potato tolerated poor soil, required less water management, and could survive the kind of storm damage that would destroy a rice paddy. A crop that reliably produced calories under difficult agricultural conditions became the foundation of the food supply, not because anyone in the 1600s understood its antioxidant content, but because it kept people fed through years mainland Japan's staple crop could not have managed on the same land. This detail tends to get lost when purple sweet potato shows up in a modern nutrition video, usually presented as one healthy option among many, alongside kale and blueberries, and whatever else fits neatly into a superfood list. That framing understates what the actual historical record shows. This was not a garnish in a varied diet. For a meaningful stretch of the 20th century, on an island with limited arable land and periodic food scarcity, purple sweet potato was closer to what rice is to most of the rest of Japan, or what wheat is to much of Europe. The base. The thing a meal was built around, not added to. What makes the discussion nutritionally interesting rather than just historically interesting is what the potato actually contains, beyond the calories that kept an entire population fed through decades that included wartime scarcity and post-war reconstruction. The purple color comes from anthocyanins, the same broad class of antioxidant pigment compounds found in blueberries and red cabbage, and purple sweet potato varieties carry them in concentrations high enough that some comparative nutrition analyses rank them above blueberries by weight. Anthocyanins have shown anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity across a wide range of laboratory and population studies, though as with most dietary compounds, isolating their individual contribution from the surrounding whole food and overall dietary pattern remains genuinely difficult. The potato also carries a meaningful fiber load and a glycemic profile lower than white potato or white rice, a detail that matters more than it might initially seem, because a population eating a carbohydrate-dense diet as its caloric foundation needed that carbohydrate to not spike blood sugar the way refined grains do. Researchers studying the traditional Okinawan diet's relationship to metabolic health have pointed to this specific property, a high-volume, low glycemic index staple carbohydrate, as one plausible mechanism behind the historically low rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease documented in the centenarian cohort, set against a Western diet built more heavily around refined carbohydrates with a much steeper blood sugar impact. Hara Hachibu deserves more explanation than a single mention, because it functions less as a rule and more as an inherited reflex. The phrase is a Confucian teaching that predates the centenarian study by centuries, traditionally recited before meals in older Okinawan households, as a reminder to stop eating at roughly 80% fullness rather than continue to complete satisfaction. Researchers studying the practice have connected it to a meaningfully lower average caloric intake across the traditional Okinawan population compared to mainland Japan and far below typical American intake, sustained not through calorie counting or conscious restriction in the modern dieting sense, but through a cultural habit absorbed the way table manners are absorbed, practiced without the person actively thinking about it at each meal. None of this happened in isolation from the rest of how people in Okinawa actually lived and ate. The traditional dietary pattern was calorie-sparse by modern American standards, not through deliberate restriction as an eating disorder would produce it, but through a cultural practice called hara hachibu, eating until roughly 80% full, rather than to complete satiety, a habit reinforced by community norms rather than individual willpower alone. The diet was also plant-heavy beyond the sweet potato specifically, built around garden-grown vegetables, tofu, seaweed, and only modest amounts of fish or pork, usually reserved for specific occasions rather than daily consumption the way meat functions in a typical modern diet. Dementia rates in the Okinawan Centenarian cohort came in dramatically lower than age-matched populations elsewhere, with some estimates putting the gap at 50 to 65% below comparable Western populations, a finding that researchers have connected to several overlapping factors rather than any single cause. Sustained low insulin signaling from a low glycemic diet, reduced inflammatory load from high anthocyanin and phytonutrient intake, caloric moderation reducing metabolic stress over a lifetime, and a social structure that kept people physically active and socially embedded well into old age, all appear in the literature as plausible contributing mechanisms, and untangling exactly how much weight each factor carries individually is not something a single study or a single vegetable can settle on its own. It would be a mistake to read this as purple sweet potato functioning like a drug, where eating more produces a proportionally larger benefit. The Okinawan pattern that researchers actually documented was a whole dietary and lifestyle system, the potato at its caloric center, but inseparable from the fiber and phytonutrient-rich vegetables surrounding it, the moderate portions, the physical activity built into daily life through gardening and walking, rather than scheduled exercise, and a social fabric that gave people a reason to stay engaged with their community across an entire lifespan. A person in an entirely different food and social environment, adding purple sweet potato to an otherwise unchanged diet, is adopting one ingredient from a system, not replicating the system itself. The kind of breakfast that shows up repeatedly in accounts of the traditional diet is unremarkable on its face. Steamed purple sweet potato alongside a small portion of miso soup and pickled vegetables. The sort of meal a woman in her 90s from that generation would describe not as a health choice, but simply as what breakfast was. This distinction matters more than it might seem, because it separates the Okinawan pattern from the modern experience of deliberately adopting a superfood, where a person makes an effortful choice against the pull of a food environment stocked with easier, more processed alternatives. That generation never had to resist that pull in the same way, because the processed alternatives simply were not part of daily life yet. The health outcome researchers eventually documented was downstream of an ordinary, unremarkable habit repeated for decades, not a wellness intervention anyone consciously adopted. There is also a documented complication in the more recent Okinawan story worth including honestly, because it actually strengthens the case for the traditional diet rather than undermining it. Younger generations of Okinawans, raised after American military presence and post-war economic change introduced more processed food, fast food, and Western dietary patterns to the islands, have not maintained the same health advantages their grandparents' generation shows. Okinawa's rank among Japanese prefectures for life expectancy has fallen substantially since the mid-1900s cohort was young, particularly among men, a shift researchers link directly to the departure from the traditional diet, including the declining role of purple sweet potato as a caloric staple in favor of rice, processed carbohydrates, and imported convenience food. This is not a footnote. It is close to a natural experiment showing what happens within the same genetic population when the dietary pattern actually changes, and the results point toward the traditional diet mattering a great deal, not toward genetics alone explaining the centenarian pattern. Okinawa's standing relative to the rest of Japan tells its own version of this story in numbers rather than anecdote. For much of the post-war period, Okinawa held the highest life expectancy of any of Japan's 47 prefectures, a striking distinction given that Japan as a whole already ranks among the longest-lived nations on Earth, meaning Okinawa was outperforming a national baseline that was already unusually high. That ranking has since slipped, particularly among men, coinciding with the decades in which the traditional diet's caloric center shifted away from purple sweet potato toward rice, processed food, and a westernized food supply, introduced partly through decades of American military presence on the islands. A population moving from the top of an already exceptional national ranking toward the middle, within a couple of generations, without any change in genetics, is difficult to explain through anything other than the environmental and dietary shift that actually happened. Purple sweet potato is not difficult to find outside Okinawa. Varieties with comparable anthocyanin content grow across parts of Asia and are increasingly available in Western grocery stores, sometimes labeled Okinawan sweet potato, sometimes Stokes purple, sometimes simply purple sweet potato, distinguishable by the deep violet flesh underneath skin that often looks tan or light brown, rather than the vibrant purple the interior suggests. Preparation traditionally involves steaming or roasting rather than frying, which preserves more of the fiber structure and avoids adding the refined oil and sugar that turn an otherwise beneficial staple carbohydrate into something closer to dessert. The honest summary is not that a purple vegetable holds a secret to living past 100. It is that an entire generation of people who did live past 100 built the caloric center of their daily eating around a fiber-rich, low-glycemic, anthocyanin-dense root vegetable for decades before anyone thought to study why they were living so long. And when the generations after them moved away from that pattern, their health outcomes moved with it.